Walter Isaacson is a true intellectual and scholar. His books have tackled some of the most fascinating and complex individuals in history, including Albert Einstein, Henry Kissinger, and Steve Jobs. Most recently, his biography, Steve Jobs, became an international bestseller, setting new records for sales of a biography. But Walter is not just a writer. He is a renowned leader, having served as chairman of CNN, editor of Time magazine, and chairman of the Broadcasting Board of Governors. He currently serves as CEO of the Aspen Institute and is active with Teach for America, which is an organization that also helps promote literacy. His other passions include education and fostering strong international relations. We are thrilled to have him here tonight. Please welcome Walter Isaacson.
Thank you very much, Ellie, and I can't wait to be at the wedding. I've never stayed at Kennebunkport. It'll be a great pleasure. It's a great honor to be here, Mr. President, with you. As a historian, or at least an aspiring historian, I can say with confidence that President George H.W. Bush will go down in history as one of the greatest presidents this country has ever had, foreign and domestically. And it's also, of course, a great honor to be here with the First Lady of Literacy, those of us who make our living writing books. We appreciate the fact that people will teach people how to read them. It might help our trade someday. But also, it stands for so much more. As Mrs. Bush has said, every kid in America who's willing to work hard deserves a decent opportunity to succeed, and that comes from literacy. Those are her words, but she has made those words come alive. I thought it was appropriate, since we're talking about teaching kids, that my reading from the Book of Jobs will be just a few paragraphs about an intervention that happened when he was a young kid. It's about him with his father and mother, the parents who adopted him, an auto mechanic in California. The childhood that Paul and Clara Jobs created for their new son was in many ways a stereotype of the 1950s. When Steve was 2, they adopted a baby girl they named Patty, and 3 years later, they moved to a tract home in the suburbs. There, Paul worked as a repo man, repossessing cars for a finance company in its Palo Alto office. But there, Paul tried to pass along his love of mechanics and his love of cars. "Steve, this is your workbench now," he said as he marked off a section of the garage. Jobs remembers being impressed by his father's focus on craftsmanship. "I thought my dad's sense of design was pretty good," he said. I thought my dad's sense of design was pretty good, he said, because he knew how to build anything. If we needed a cabinet, he would build it. And when we built a fence, he gave me a hammer so I could work with him. When I started working with Steve Jobs on the book, he made me walk around the neighborhood to that fence. And as we did, he made me go to the back of the fence, the part nobody could see, and to touch it. 50 years later, I write, the fence still stands there. As Jobs showed it off to me, he caressed the stockade panels and recalled a lesson his father had implanted in him as a young boy. It was important, his father said, to craft the back of the cabinets, the back of the fences, just as properly and just as beautifully as the parts that people would see. He loved doing things right. He cared about the perfection and the beauty, even of the parts unseen. And to me, as a biographer, we're always looking for that rosebud moment, that childhood lesson that caused somebody to have the particular passion that they do. For Steve Jobs, it was a passion for perfection. Sometimes that drove people crazy. Sometimes that drove people insane, but always drove them to do things that they did not know they would be able to do. And that's because he believed that if you really care about something, you care about the parts unseen. When they were building the original Macintosh computer in 1983, late 1983, Steve made sure that the case was beautiful, that it was sealed, that the icons on the screen were gorgeous. And at one point, they were just finishing it up, and Steve looked at the circuit board. And he said, this circuit board stinks. he actually said slightly stronger word, but I'm in Houston, so I know the refined sensibilities here. And they said, what do you mean? He said, well, the chips aren't lined up straight. It's not a beautiful circuit board. And they said, Steve, but nobody will see it. Nobody will ever know. And Steve told them the story about the stockade fence and caressing the back of it. And he said, yes, you will know. So they hold up shipping the original Macintosh for about 6 weeks until they could redo a circuit board so that all the chips were lined up and so that it was beautiful, even though nobody would ever see it and nobody would ever know. And when they did, Steve had everybody, all 30 engineers on the original Mac team, sign a whiteboard with Stephen P. Jobs all in lowercase in the middle to engrave on the inside of the original Macintosh, which you couldn't open up, you'd never know it, but Steve said real artists sign their work. Every time I write a biography, I look for that moment that gives the person passion. For Albert Einstein, it was the same age. His father gave him a compass, and Einstein was mesmerized by it. He would turn it, and the needle would twitch and point north, however he turned it. And nothing was touching that needle. There was no physical reason for the needle to move. And he started thinking about force fields and what is a field? Why would that happen? Now, you and I probably remember getting a compass when we were kids, right? And we go, wow, look, it points north. And then about, 30 seconds later, we're on, oh, look, a dead squirrel or whatever. We're on to something else. Throughout his life, he was still trying to figure out, how would you do a unified field theory that would tie together the field of electromagnetism and gravity and particles? And to his deathbed, he was still writing equations on a field theory. Even as a young 17-year-old runaway, he was sort of studying Maxwell's equations. And if you look at Maxwell's equations, or if you're Einstein and you look at Maxwell's equations, they say that a field, an electromagnetic field, a light wave, radio wave, has to travel at a constant speed. It's always traveling relative to you at a constant speed, even if you're going really fast to the source of the light or really fast away. And he kept saying, well, what if I caught up with the light beam? Wouldn't the light be stationary next to me? And he said, but Maxwell's equations don't allow for that, and it caused me such anxieties, my palms were sweating. Now, I know what was causing my palms to sweat growing up in New Orleans at age 17. It was not Maxwell's equations. But that's why he's Einstein and we aren't. But even as he finally can't get a job, he can't get a teaching job, anything else, he's made a third-class clerk in a patent office in Bern, Switzerland. And he's looking at devices that synchronize clocks because the Swiss have gone on standard time zones. And if you know any Swiss people, they tend to be really Swiss. They really care that it's going to strike 7 in Bern at the exact same moment it'll strike 7 in Geneva. And the only way to do that is to send a signal between the two clocks. And that signal travels at the speed of light, whether it's a light signal or radio. And you still have this kid thinking, as he's a patent clerk, what if I caught up with the signal? And his leap of the imagination is simply, if I'm traveling really, really fast, trying to catch up with that signal, what clocks will look synchronized will be different to me than somebody who's traveling in a different direction or not traveling. And so from that, he comes up with a simple theory, a leap of the imagination, that he gets it. The speed of light is always constant, but time is relative, depending on our state of motion. It was a leap of the imagination that just came from always being curious about why does that compass needle twitch and point north. And as for Ben Franklin, he would have been a patron saint of the Barbara Bush Foundation. Because when he was a kid, the thing that most affected him was he was the 10th son of a Puritan minister. He was going to get to go to Harvard to be his father's tithe to the Lord, because Harvard was going to train him to be a minister. This was many years ago when Harvard knew how to train ministers. But Franklin wasn't exactly cut for the cloth. At one point, he says to his dad, when they're salting away the provisions, he says, why don't I say grace right now, and we could get it done with over for once and for all for the entire winter, and won't have to say grace again. And so they realized it'd be a waste of money to send him to Harvard to be a minister. So he gets apprenticed to his brother, who is a book publisher. And his older brother, James Franklin, runs a newspaper, printing shop, and publishing house. And Benjamin Franklin decides to teach himself to read. And he pulls down the books every night, making sure that he doesn't crease the pages, that nobody catches him, and reads Addison and Steele and Daniel Defoe, all the great books of that time, and writes out the essays by hand, and then tries to rewrite them in his own words. And he does it so well that he decides he wants to write for his brother's newspaper. But as Neil Bush can explain to you, this was an older brother, and sometimes it's difficult to deal with older brothers. So he couldn't get a job on his brother's paper, and so he had to do it under a pseudonym, Silence Do Good. And he would slip the essays under the door at night, and he pretended to be a widowed elderly woman living in the countryside of Massachusetts. A triumph of the imagination. That's what literacy does for you. It lets the imagination triumph. And throughout his whole life, Benjamin Franklin was the best scientist, the best diplomat, one of the greatest statesmen that we had. But most of all, he was somebody who knew that words have power. And from the meaning of those words and the power of those words, that's how we define who we are. So let me say on behalf of three people I know well, Ben Franklin, Albert Einstein, and Steve Jobs, I toast you and Mrs. Bush for the Literacy Foundation. Thank you.